"That old uniform doesn't belong in here, Grandpa. This is a veterans ceremony, not a costume party." The event coordinator's sharp voice cuts through the VFW hall as 84-year-old Colonel William Bill Turner stands near the entrance, his old dress uniform hanging loose on his thin body. Around him, younger veterans and their families turn to stare at the elderly man holding a small wooden box. Not knowing that inside is the distinguished service cross he earned leading the most secret mission of the Korean War. Someone finally reads his unit tag will shock you. Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone judge a veteran by their appearance? This story will remind you why we should never underestimate our heroes. Colonel Bill Turner had spent 3 hours that morning getting ready for the Veterans Day ceremony at the local VFW hall. His granddaughter Sarah had helped him press his old dress uniform the night before, though they both knew it would never look the same as it did 50 years ago. The fabric was thin in places, the colors had faded, and it hung loose on his shrinking frame, but it was the only dress uniform he had, and he wanted to honor his fallen brothers. The ceremony was supposed to celebrate all veterans, from World War II to the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Bill had received a special invitation because he was one of the oldest veterans in the county. He'd been looking forward to it for weeks, but from the moment he walked through the doors, Bill could tell something was wrong. The event coordinator, a woman in her 40s named Janet Phillips, looked him up and down with obvious disapproval. She wore a crisp business suit and carried a clipboard like a weapon. Behind her stood several other organizers, all looking uncomfortable as they watched the scene unfold. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Janet said, stepping closer to Bill. "This is a formal ceremony, and we have standards to maintain." Bill blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't understand. I have an invitation." He reached into his pocket with shaking hands and pulled out the formal invitation he'd received 2 weeks earlier. Janet barely glanced at it. "I don't care what you have," she said loudly. "Look at yourself. That uniform is a disgrace. It's wrinkled, faded, and frankly, it's embarrassing to have you here, representing veterans." The hall had been buzzing with conversation, but now people were starting to notice the commotion near the entrance. Younger veterans in crisp uniforms turned to see what was happening. Families with children stopped their conversations and stared. "Ma," single quotes am, Bill said quietly, "this is the uniform I wore when I served my country. It may be old, but it's all I have." "Well, it's not good enough," Janet snapped. "This ceremony is being photographed for the local newspaper and social media. We can't have someone looking like that in the pictures." A younger veteran, maybe in his 30s, approached the group. He wore a perfectly pressed army uniform with recent Iraq war ribbons on his chest. "What's the problem here?" he asked. Janet turned to him with relief. "Thank goodness, someone with some sense." This man showed up looking like he bought his uniform at a thrift store. "Can you help me explain to him that this isn't appropriate?" The younger veteran looked at Bill with barely concealed disgust. "Dude, she's right. You look like you're playing dress-up. Where did you even serve the Civil War?" A few people nearby chuckled at the joke. Bill's face reddened, but he kept his composure. "I served in Korea, son, from 1950 to 1953. "Korea," the younger veteran laughed. "That was like 100 years ago. What did you do? Push papers around a desk somewhere safe? More?" People were gathering now, drawn by the raised voices and the obvious conflict. Bill could see children pointing at him, their parents whispering behind their hands. "I did what my country asked me to do," Bill replied simply. Janet crossed her arms. "Look, I'm sure you think you served your country, but this ceremony is for real veterans. People who actually fought and bled for America, not people who want to play dress-up for attention." The crowd was getting larger. Bill counted at least 30 people now watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, but others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. A woman in her 50s pushed through the crowd. She wore an expensive dress and had the confident bearing of someone used to getting her way. "What's happening here?" she demanded. Janet immediately straightened up. "Mrs. Richardson, thank God, this man is disrupting our ceremony. He's wearing some kind of fake uniform and claiming to be a veteran." Mrs. Richardson was apparently someone important, because the crowd made room for her as she approached Bill. She looked him over like he was something unpleasant she'd found. On her shoe, is this true? She asked Bill. Are you wearing a real uniform? Yes, ma'am, Bill said. This is my dress uniform from my service in the Korean War. Mrs. Richardson laughed coldly. The Korean War? Do you have any proof of that? Because, frankly, you look like one of those homeless people who dress up like soldiers to get sympathy money. The crowd murmured at this accusation. Bill felt his heart racing, but he kept his voice calm. Ma, am I have my military records at home? I can show you my discharge papers, my medals. Janet interrupted. What medals could you possibly have? A participation ribbon. The younger veteran who had first approached joined in again. Yeah, let's see these so-called medals. I bet they're fake too. Bill clutched the wooden box tighter against his chest. Inside was his Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in combat. But these people had already made up their minds about him. A teenager in the crowd called out, Hey old man, where did you get that costume? Halloween store. More laughter from the crowd. Bill could feel tears forming in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Please, he said quietly, I just want to honor my fallen brothers. That's all I came here to do, your fallen brothers. Mrs. Richardson scoffed. What brothers? The other fake veterans you hang around with. The crowd was getting crueler now, feeding off each other's energy. Someone in the back shouted, Call the police. He's probably a scammer. Another voice added, Yeah, he's probably not even a real veteran, just some old guy looking for attention. Janet stepped forward with her clipboard. Sir, I'm going to have to insist that you leave immediately. You're disrupting our ceremony, and frankly, you're making a mockery of real veterans. A man in his 20s wearing a Marine uniform pushed to the front of the crowd. He was young, fit, and obviously proud of his service. But when he looked at Bill, his expression was one of disgust. This is offensive, he said loudly. My buddies died in Afghanistan, and this old faker wants to pretend he's one of us. That's sick, the crowd murmured agreement. Bill could see the anger in their faces, the righteous indignation of people who thought they were protecting something sacred. I'm not pretending, Bill said, his voice barely above a whisper. I served my country for 3 years. I lost friends. Too bullshit, the young Marine said. If you really served, where are your buddies? Where are the other guys from your unit? Why are you here alone? Bill's hands shook as he held the wooden box. The truth was, most of his unit was dead. Not from old age, but from the mission that had earned him the medal he was carrying. A mission so classified that he'd never been able to talk about it, even to his own family. They're gone, Bill said simply. Gone where? Janet demanded. Convenient excuse. A woman in the crowd shouted, He can't even keep his story straight. Another voice added, Probably has dementia. Doesn't even remember what lies he's telling. The young Marine stepped closer to Bill, his face red with anger. You know what really pisses me off? Real veterans are struggling to get help from the VA, and fakers like you make it harder for everyone. I'm not a faker, Bill said, but his voice was weak now. The crowd was overwhelming him, their voices blending into a wall of accusation and mockery. Janet looked around at the crowd with satisfaction. She had their support, and she was going to use it, ladies and gentlemen, she announced. This is exactly why we need to be careful about who we let into our ceremonies. This man is clearly not a real veteran, and his presence here is disrespectful to everyone who actually served. The crowd applauded. Bill felt like he was shrinking under their stares and their judgment. Mrs. Richardson pulled out her phone. I'm posting about this on social media. People need to know about these fake veterans who show up at our events. Within seconds, she was typing rapidly on her phone. Hashtag fake veteran, hashtag stolen valor number. Veterans Datha. Young Marine crossed his arms. You should be ashamed of yourself, old man. Wearing that uniform when you never earned the right, Bill looked around at the faces surrounding him. There had to be at least 50 people now, all looking at him with disgust, anger, or amusement. No one was defending him. No one was asking questions. They had all decided that he was a fraud. A little girl tugged on her mother's dress. Mommy, why is everyone being mean to the old man? Her mother quickly pulled her away. Don't look at him, honey. Some people lie to get attention. The crowd was getting louder now, more aggressive. Someone shouted, Get him out of here, another voice. Yeah, call the police. Janet raised her hand for quiet. Sir, you have exactly 2 minutes to leave this building, or I'm calling security. And if you ever show up at another veterans event in this county, I'll make sure everyone knows you're a fake. Bill looked down at the wooden box in his hands. Inside was the metal that proved everything he was saying. But he'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Not because you couldn't win them, but because winning them would cost more than losing. As he turned to leave, he heard Mrs. Richardson's voice behind him. And don't think about coming back. We don't tolerate stolen valor in this community. The crowd cheered as Bill walked slowly toward the exit. His legs felt weak, and his heart was pounding in his chest. 53 years since he'd come home from Korea, and he'd never felt more alone than he did right now. But just as he reached the door, it opened from the outside. A tall man in a crisp army uniform walked in, followed by several other military personnel. The man was clearly high-ranking. His uniform was covered in ribbons and insignia. He had the bearing of someone who had spent decades in command. The crowd immediately quieted as they saw the impressive group of military officers entering the hall. The lead officer, a man in his early 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes, stopped. When he saw Bill near the door, "Colonel Turner," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent hall. Bill turned around, surprised to hear his name and rank. The officer approached him with a look of recognition and respect. "Sir, I'm Brigadier General Marcus Webb. I've been looking for you." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the general extended his hand to Bill. But instead of just shaking hands, the general stepped closer and read the unit patch on Bill's faded uniform. His face went completely white. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your Ghost Company." The other officers behind him immediately came to attention. When they heard those words, the crowd didn't understand what was happening, but they could see that everything had suddenly changed. General Webb turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years of military command. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "you are in the presence of one of the most decorated soldiers in American history." The hall was completely silent now. Janet's face had gone pale, and Mrs. Richardson was slowly lowering her phone. The general turned back to Bill. "Sir, I've read your classified files. What you and your unit did in Korea saved thousands of American lives. The mission behind enemy lines, the intelligence you gathered, the men you brought home. It's legendary." Bill looked surprised. "Sir, that mission is still classified. How do you... The general smiled. "Some things have been declassified in recent years. Colonel, your story is finally being told. In fact, that's why I'm here. The Pentagon sent me to find you." He gestured to the wooden box in Bill's hands. "Is that what I think it is?" Bill nodded slowly and opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was the Distinguished Service Cross. But it wasn't just any Distinguished Service Cross. It was one of only 12 ever awarded for the Korean War. The general and his officers immediately saluted. The sight of high-ranking military officers saluting the elderly man in the faded uniform sent shockwaves through the crowd. "Colonel Turner," the general said, "your unit patch identifies you as a member of Ghost Company, 1st Special Operations. Group. Your unit was so classified that it officially didn't exist. You and 17 other men were dropped behind enemy lines for a mission that lasted 6 months. Only 3 of you came home." The crowd was hanging on every word. Janet looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The general's voice got stronger. "The intelligence you gathered broke the Chinese supply lines and shortened the war by at least a year. Conservative estimates say your mission saved 50,000 American lives." Bill's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, we lost 14 good men on that mission. I've carried their names with me every day for over 50 years. The general nodded solemnly. "I know, sir, and that's why I'm here. The Pentagon is finally declassifying Ghost Company. There's going to be a ceremony at the White House next month. The president wants to personally thank the surviving members of your unit." He paused and looked around at the stunned crowd. "There are only 2 of you left alive, Colonel. You and Master Sergeant Rodriguez in Texas. You're the last of the ghosts." Young Marine, who had been so aggressive earlier, stepped forward, his face red with shame. "Sir, I'm sorry. I had no idea." The general's expression hardened. "What exactly did you have no idea about, Marine?" The young man looked at the floor. We thought he was fake. His uniform is so old, and the general cut him off. His uniform is old because he's earned the right to wear it for over 70 years. That faded fabric represents more courage and sacrifice than most people see in 10 lifetimes. He looked around at the crowd, his voice getting colder. This man is a living legend. While you were questioning his right to be here, he was quietly carrying the weight of a classified mission that most people will never even know happened. Janet finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. General, we didn't know. If we had known, the general turned to her with ice in his eyes. Ma'am, you didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. You saw an elderly man in an old uniform and decided he wasn't worth your respect. That says everything about your character and nothing about his . Mrs. Richardson stepped forward, her face pale. General, I posted something on social media. I need to take it down. The general's expression showed what he thought of that priority. Ma'am, the damage is already done. You publicly humiliated a war hero because you thought his uniform wasn't good enough for your photographs. He turned back to Bill. Colonel, I owe you an apology on behalf of everyone here. This is not how America should treat its heroes. Bill shook his head. General, these people didn't know. I never talked about my service. How could they? The general smiled sadly. Sir, that's exactly what makes you a hero. You've been carrying the weight of that mission alone for over 50 years, and you never asked for recognition or special treatment. You just wanted to honor your fallen brothers. He gestured to the wooden box. That Distinguished Service Cross represents one of the most dangerous missions in military history. You earned it by volunteering for a mission that everyone knew was probably suicide. And you've been carrying the guilt of surviving when 14 of your men didn't. The crowd was completely silent, absorbing the weight of what they'd witnessed. Many people were crying, ashamed of how they'd treated this quiet hero. The general looked around the hall one more time. I want everyone here to understand something. This man represents the best of America. He served his country in the shadows, never seeking glory or recognition. He came home and lived a quiet life, raising his children and grandchildren, never talking about the horrors he'd seen or the friends he'd lost. He paused to let that sink. And today, all he wanted was to attend a Veterans Day ceremony to honor his fallen brothers. Instead, you tried to throw him out because his uniform wasn't pretty enough for your pictures. Janet was crying now. Sir, we're so sorry. If there's anything we can do, The general held up his hand. Ma'am, the only thing you can do is learn. From this, never again assume you know someone's story based on their appearance. This man has more courage in his little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. He turned to address the entire crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to remember this day. Remember that heroes don't always look like what you expect. They don't always have perfect uniforms or smooth stories. Sometimes they're just quiet old men who carry their sacrifices with dignity and never ask for anything in return. Bill looked around at the faces in the crowd. Where before he'd seen mockery and disgust, now he saw shame, respect, and understanding. The young Marine approached him again, this time with tears in his eyes. Sir, I'm deeply sorry for what I said. You're the kind of soldier I hope to be someday. Son, you've served your country with honor. That's all any of us can do. Just remember that every veteran has a story, even if they don't tell it. Mrs. Richardson approached with her phone in her hand. Colonel Turner, I've deleted my post and posted a correction. I've told everyone what really happened here today. I'm so ashamed of myself. Bill nodded. Thank you, ma'am. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we handle them. The general stepped forward again. Colonel, I hate to cut this short, but we have a car waiting outside. The Pentagon wants to meet with you about the declassification ceremony as they prepared to leave. Bill looked around the VFW hall one more time. The same people who had tried to throw him out an hour earlier were now watching him with respect and admiration. Before we go, the general announced to the crowd, I want you to know that Colonel Turner's story will be told. The Pentagon is declassifying Ghost Company as part of a new initiative to honor forgotten heroes of the Korean War. He looked directly at Janet and Mrs. Richardson. I suggest you use this experience to make sure your future events truly honor all veterans. regardless of how they look or how old their uniforms are. As Bill walked toward the door, with the general and his staff, the entire hall stood and began to applaud. It started slowly, but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation that followed him all the way to the door. Outside, Bill paused before getting into the government car. "General," he said, "those people in there aren't bad people. They just didn't understand." The general smiled. "Sir, that's exactly the kind of grace and forgiveness that makes you a hero. Most people would be angry after what you just went through." Bill looked back at the VFW hall, where people were still watching through the windows. Maybe this will help them understand that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes we're young and strong, and sometimes we're old and our uniforms don't fit quite right anymore. The general nodded. "Colonel, your story is going to inspire a lot of people. The world needs to hear about Ghost Company and what you men did in Korea."